So today I'm going to make the case that the next 1 billion people to enter the Bitcoin space are not only coming a lot faster than most people expect them to come, but why we as Bitcoiners are actively failing them today. So we're going to do that by looking at 3 things today. So the first thing we're going to look at is why nobody is prepared for exponential change and why Bitcoin has fundamentally entered its second epoch that is very different from its first epoch that we saw between 2009 and 2020. So that's the first thing we're going to discuss. We're also going to be discussing why I believe the Bitcoiners are winning the battle, but we are losing the war. And then we're going to look at what is going to happen if we continue to lose this war that I believe we as Bitcoiners are losing today, okay? I think we have a once in a species opportunity to have a great reset, so to say, and potentially put 0.1 Bitcoin into the hands of 100 million families around the world. But if we continue losing the war that we are losing, I don't think we're going to actually be able to reset the fiat system and redistribute wealth in ways that we could, okay? I believe we have the potential to create a Bitcoin mafia, so to say, but only if we can beat these entities like these Bitcoin ETFs and BlackRock and friends. Now, the only way we are going to be able to be ready for the next 1 billion Bitcoiners is if we skate to where the puck is going. Now, this video is going to be a little bit of a longer one, but that is because you are getting a behind the scenes glimpse of a speech I'm actually going to be performing here in Madeira, Portugal this week. So I hope this is going to be worth it. I've probably put 10 times more research into this speech than I do for normal videos, which I do spend a lot of time in. So I hope that the next 30 minutes are going to be worth it. I want to start off today's video by talking about why we are already failing, even though Bitcoin adoption levels between 2009 and 2024 have been what I believe is going to be the slowest rates of adoption we've ever seen. And considering this, we are still failing as Bitcoiners. I believe that this chart right here proves that we are failing as Bitcoiners. Now, don't get me wrong. Gambling is always going to win some sort of attention. Somebody's always going to want to make a quick buck. But my argument is we are losing too many potential Bitcoiners to the altcoin scammers. I know because I was one of them way back in 2017. I fell for all of the garbage crypto scammers on YouTube, and I didn't personally find Bitcoin Twitter until 2019. It took me literally 2 years of wading through the noise on YouTube before I actually found a little bit of signal on Bitcoin Twitter. And I believe that the need for us to improve our education online is only going to improve because we need to think about what kind of Bitcoiner is coming into the space each cycle. So in 2013, what kind of person was entering the Bitcoin space? Essentially, it was just the cypherpunks. It was the very early innovators on the adoption curve. And you've got to think each cycle that we've gone through, the archetype of the person who's entering the Bitcoin space is changing, okay? I've provocatively made this little chart here that's kind of overlaying the IQ of the general population onto the Bitcoin chart. And I think that to understand Bitcoin way back in 2013, you were an outlier, okay? You had a very high IQ to find a trend so early. And no offense to the people who found Bitcoin later, I was one of them. I was a smooth brain who didn't find Bitcoin until 2017. But I think the IQ is dropping each cycle, which means our message has to change every single cycle. Right now, I believe the state of Bitcoin education today in 2024 is actually perfect to orange pill somebody who's coming into the space new in 2013. I think our education that we're spreading online is only broadly appealing to those kind of people who would have entered the Bitcoin space in 2013. We need to change that. We are 11 years behind schedule in my estimation, and we need to change it quickly because Bitcoin adoption, in my eyes, I think is only going to accelerate. I'm going to make the case for that in a second, but I want to also talk about where we are in Bitcoin's adoption cycle. Now, this is the impossible question to answer in Bitcoin because there's so many different ways to measure Bitcoin adoption. How do you measure it? Is it based upon the amount of users? Is it based upon how many people have put more than 50% of their net worth into Bitcoin? Very difficult to measure. I'll give you guys a couple of different ideas and estimations. Blockware ran what I thought was probably a very well-researched and very detailed report in 2022, but I thought it was a little bit on the conservative side. They showed that global adoption was somewhere around 0.4%. I think there was around like 10 to 30 million active users of Bitcoin in their estimations from memory. The more bullish estimation is these kind of estimations here. So this estimation is actually showing that quote unquote Bitcoin and crypto adoption is outpacing the growth of the internet in the 1990s. So again, this is the more bullish estimation. I don't believe with this. They say that there's 600 million blockchain users, and this is outpacing the growth of the internet. But I think studies like this are obviously too bullish, and I don't think they're measuring adoption correctly, but I think they could be measuring Bitcoin awareness correctly, okay? Because if you have a blockchain wallet, you're obviously aware of Bitcoin, and you've kind of, you know enough about the broader space, so to say, we'll pop that in quotation marks, to know that you should be using Bitcoin, and you know, there's obviously people shitcoining, but that's aside from the point. I think this measures Bitcoin awareness, okay? And this could be a better proxy to actually track adoption because somebody's trying to use the technology. Yes, we're ignoring the fact they're getting scammed by scammers and they're adopting shitcoins, but they are adopting the technology, okay? So let's move on. So right now, at current rates of adoption, we are outpacing the adoption of the internet, but we are failing. We are not keeping up. And I believe that doesn't matter what way you measure adoption, whether it is 0.5% or on the bullish side, 7.5%, we are actively failing as Bitcoiners. We are not keeping up with adoption. And the bad thing is that all technologies get adopted in exponential waves. This is not controversial. Every single technology that's gone mainstream has been adopted exponentially. Most people would have to agree with that. Not controversial at all, but maybe something that could be interesting to look at is what does exponential actually look like? Okay, well, this is a really cool chart here. Absolutely love it. And we can see that it's actually measuring the adoption rates of mobile phones, automobiles, and broadband internet. So 3 of the larger technologies that have been adopted over the past 50 to 100 years, right? And we can see that on average, they follow a very similar kind of adoption curve, so to say. So it took mobile phones 14 years to go from 0 to 10% adoption. Then it took the mobile phone the same amount of time, so 10 years to go from 10% adoption to 90% adoption. So that is essentially nearly fully adopted by society. We saw the exact same thing with automobiles. It took 10 years for automobiles to go from around 0% adoption to 10% adoption. And then guess what? The exact same thing happened as what happened with mobile phones. In 14 years, the automobile went from 10% adoption to 90% adoption. Something very similar with broadband internet. It went from 0 to 10% adoption in 10 years. And then we saw a very similar thing with broadband internet. It went from 0 to 10% adoption in around 8 years. And it took around 8 years to go from 10% adoption to 90% adoption. Now, again, you can disagree with how they measure adoptions on these 3 various technologies. I think overall, it gives us a good look at an average framework to follow. Okay, so where is Bitcoin? Well, we know that Bitcoin's somewhere between 0.5% adoption and 7% quote unquote awareness, okay? So I think it's interesting that Bitcoin's 15 years old. That's kind of a similar time frame that it took mobile phones, automobiles, and the broadband internet to find an inflection point where adoption did start to go exponential. And so Bitcoin's 15 years old now. Are we seeing any signs that we're seeing an increased rate of adoption, or maybe things are a little bit different? So an inflection point is also known as kind of like crossing the chasm, okay? This term has been recently popularized by Chamath Palihapitiya, and that is essentially talking about how a technology has to be able to market itself to the early majority and the late majority of society. Lots of technologies are great, okay? They're very useful, but they're only ever able to market themselves to a very small niche of users. And that kind of stops them from getting this broad acceptance and adoption by the entire society. Let's start looking at some reasons for whether Bitcoin is actually able to cross the chasm. And I'm going to make the controversial case for why an exponential period of adoption has already started. So let's move on and take a look at a few of the data points I want to show you guys. So we are seeing exponential peer-to-peer adoption in the Bitcoin space. We are watching new Bitcoin peer-to-peer communities grow exponentially all around the world. So in 2013, we had 1. 2019, we saw 4. 2021, we saw 9, okay? Adoption starting to pick up a bit here. And then 2022, we can see there's over 30 Bitcoin peer-to-peer economies all around the world, okay? So this is exponential growth, no doubt about it. And I've been lucky enough to travel to a number of these Bitcoin peer-to-peer communities. And I can tell you on the ground, we are winning the battle. There are no shitcoins in El Salvador. Bitcoin peer-to-peer economies are booming everywhere. And there's not so much of this in the land of crypto. So we are winning. We have to ask ourselves, is this how we're going to scale to the next 1 billion Bitcoiners? We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a second, but I want to keep making the exponential case, okay? Exponential hash rate. Again, I know this chart here is a little bit of chart crime, and when you put the chart of Bitcoin hash rate in a logarithmic form, it's a little bit better. It doesn't look so exponential, but what we are seeing is something we've never seen before in Bitcoin's life. We're seeing a quote-unquote inflection point. The 2022 Bitcoin bear market was the first Bitcoin bear market where the hash rate did not follow price, okay? It was the first bear market where price drew down 70% from that all-time high in December 2021, but the Bitcoin hash rate actually continued hitting new all-time highs all the way up. And this is because this is the first bear market where we have nation states overtly mining Bitcoin, okay? Oman sunk $1.1 billion into Bitcoin mining. El Salvador have done the same, sunk billions of dollars into Bitcoin mining. Saudi Arabia sunk $2 billion into Bitcoin mining. The Kingdom of Bhutan in Southeast Asia, quietly mining Bitcoin for the past 5 years. You guys all know the stories. We talk about this all the time on the channel. But what we're most interested in today is that inflection point in 2021. The same thing with Bitcoin peer-to-peer adoption. We saw an inflection point in 2020. That's when adoption started to go exponential. I think we're seeing something similar in regards to the amount of supply available for Bitcoin. So we're seeing an exponential rise in the amount of peer-to-peer communities around the world. We're watching an exponential rise in the amount of people mining Bitcoin and something different in the mining space. At the same time, I think we could be seeing something similar in the supply. So for the first 11 years of Bitcoin's life, 85% of the Bitcoin was mined and nobody understood the asset, which is what you're about to understand by the next chart. But in the next 11 years, so between 2020 and 2031, you're going to see that only 9% of the available Bitcoin is going to be mined and potentially up for sale if the miners even decide to sell it. But then we need to start talking about a really interesting chart. It's actually my favorite. We're watching an exponentially shrinkage in the amount of supply available for sale. So we can see here for the first 11 years of Bitcoin's life, coins on exchanges only increased. We only saw more Bitcoin put onto exchanges for sale. The exchange balance actually grew from 0 to 3.1 million, if my memory serves me correctly. Since then, we have seen 1.3 million Bitcoin absolutely disappear from exchanges. That represents 35% of all the available Bitcoin available for sale on exchanges has shrunk by 35%, okay? So it's almost as if something changed in 2020. We saw an inflection point in 2020. That is why I'm going to continue to make the case for why Bitcoin has entered its second epoch. So era 1 between 2009 and 2020, this was a period of time where Bitcoin trading was dominated by retail speculators. It was only people who did not understand Bitcoin that were trading Bitcoin. They were buying Bitcoin and putting it on exchanges to be sold to go and buy a Lambo, okay? We could see that clearly by the exchange balances. Bitcoin was only sold, but since 2020, it looks as if something has changed clearly in the data. So something in the Bitcoin space has changed, okay? I don't know whether we're reaching an exponential period of adoption coming up, but I think maybe we're going to see an inflection point soon. So this is only Bitcoin specific data. When you zoom out, the broader world kind of looks as if there's an advertisement seen for Bitcoin all around the world. So something in the Bitcoin space has potentially changed in the past couple of years, okay? Again, that's just my provocative case. You don't need to believe me to agree with this overall thesis I'm going to present to you guys in the final parts of today's video, okay? But I believe something in the macro space is definitely changing. And I think we're actually seeing something we've never seen before in human history. And that is why I call Bitcoin the Big Bang to end all cycles. Because in the 2020s, we are watching the convergence of a number of cycles all unwinding today at the exact same time. So we have the 90-year fourth turning cycle, okay? That is unwinding today in the 2020s. The fourth turning is unwinding. We entered the fourth turning in 2008. And the next 22 years, so from 2008 to 2030, we are in the crisis era of the fourth turning. We're also in what Lynn Alden actually calls the second stage of the deleveraging of the 80-year long-term debt cycle, okay? Now, the first two cycles are a little bit more difficult to argue with, so to say. But then if you really zoom out and have a look at things on a 250-year cycle, you can see that every 250 years, you actually see a new revolution. So we saw the separation of church and state in around the 1520s, okay? Now, if you go 250 years forward from the 1520s, that takes you to the 1770s. And during the 1770s, we saw the American Declaration of Independence, and we also saw the French Revolution happening at the same time. Okay, so again, two of the biggest revolutions in history. And if you go 250 years forward from the 1770s, guess where that takes you to? Exactly, the 2020s. I believe many other Bitcoiners have made this case before that we could be watching the separation of the money and state today in the 2020s, exactly 500 years after we saw the separation of church and state in the 1520s. Pretty poetic, but again, this is very zoomed out. And again, who knows what's happening? But then I believe we are also seeing the sovereign individual thesis play out today in the 2020s, okay? That is the thesis that we are transitioning from an industrial-based society to information-based society. Okay, the authors of The Sovereign Individual obviously wrote that book in 1997, and they just called it the revolution of the 2000s. They didn't put a specific date on when this revolution would take place, but I believe that with the acceleration of online work that we're seeing and the increasingly tyrannical measures by governments all around the world that really began in 2020, I believe that the 2020s is the decade where we are watching a serious acceleration from a transition away from industrial societies towards information societies. And just think about it, the growth of digital nomads. It's gone from like 3 million digital nomads in 2018 to like 35 million in 2024. I mean, maybe it's up to 40 million now. It is the fastest growing trend behind Bitcoin and AI. Okay, and then obviously we have another cycle unwinding in the 2020s. This is the 50 to 60 year technological long wave cycle. Every 50 to 60 years, we see a new revolutionary technology that comes out and fundamentally transforms society. So we saw the Industrial Revolution in the 1770s. We saw the invention of railways, trains, and then 50 years later, we obviously saw the invention of steel, electricity, and then we saw the oil and the automobile revolution in the early 1900s. 50 to 60 years later, we saw the invention of the microprocessor, which gave rise to obviously the personal computing revolution. And now, 50 years after the invention of the microprocessor takes you to 2011. Exactly 2 years after the Bitcoin Genesis block was launched. Again, just another strange coincidence, but again, very, very interesting. I've also made the case before that Bitcoin is not the sixth technological revolution that many people are calling it. And I've actually made the case before that Bitcoin unlocks the transition to something much, much bigger. I've actually made the case before that it is going to be the digital industrial revolution 2.0. So it was the Industrial Revolution that unlocked the capability to create these 5 waves of technological revolutions. Now, I believe that Bitcoin is doing the exact same thing for the digital age in cyberspace, where we can create these 5 revolutions that are built on top of Bitcoin. Okay. Again, that's the thesis of the first book I'm writing. So that's going to take an hours and hours and hours to explain. So let's move on. What are the takeaways from the first part of today's talk? I think exponential adoption is happening. I think things are going exponential. Bitcoin is very, very low in its adoption, 0.5% or even 7% on the bullish end. All of your models that have been modeled on the first 12 to 15 years of Bitcoin data are absolutely garbage because they're not accounting for the fact that adoption is going to increase from here. Okay, I think digital gold is an absolute meme. I think diminishing returns is an absolute meme. Common consensus is always wrong, and everybody believes that diminishing returns is the thing. They're all saying, oh, but Bitcoin ETFs are going to lower Bitcoin's volatility. I disagree. I strongly disagree. I firmly believe volatility has to increase from here. I believe true Bitcoin adoption is like 0.5%. What happens when the other 99% of people come and adopt Bitcoin? Okay, now again, you got to think about this. 0.5% of people have adopted Bitcoin when 90% of the Bitcoin has been mined and pushed onto the market available for sale. This is the biggest thing. I believe when the next wave, right now, supply is being taken off the market. It has precipitously for the past 4 years. Okay, again, we talked about this. So what happens when the other 99% of society figure out Bitcoin and they want to adopt it rapidly and in an increased exponential fashion, but there is less supply on the market? Price is not going to behave in the same way that it did for the first 15 years of Bitcoin's life, okay? But again, I'm running slightly short on time, so I'm going to skip through this. You don't have to agree with anything I just said to agree with what we're going to be talking about in the next couple of sections, okay? It is undeniable that the type of Bitcoin buyer is different every Bitcoin cycle, okay? Our message and our education as Bitcoiners has to shift every Bitcoin cycle. Otherwise, we are going to fail. We are going to fail on the mission of actually orange pilling 100 million Bitcoiners. Okay, so I think the mission should be to create 100 million families with 0.1 Bitcoin. Okay, now it is the past 4 years of data that really worries me. And this is why at the moment, if we don't change anything, my base case is that Bitcoin is worth millions of dollars per coin by 2030, but global Bitcoin adoption is still less than 5%. And this is true Bitcoin adoption. And I don't want that to happen. Again, I do not want Bitcoin to be gobbled up by these entities like BlackRock and MicroStrategy and leaving no Bitcoin left for the little guy to get in at these asymmetrical prices. Okay, this is the big thing. Okay, yes, the very last person to adopt Bitcoin in the entire world is still going to be better off, even if they missed all of the price appreciation from Bitcoin just from being on a Bitcoin standard. Okay, don't get me wrong, but I'm saying that there is serious asymmetry today of buying Bitcoin at $50,000, or as Samson would say, 0.5 M Bitcoin. And I believe that if we can get as many families as possible holding 10 million Satoshis or 0.1 Bitcoin, that is potentially going to fix the fiat system. But if we can get 100 million families holding 0.1 Bitcoin, I think that has the potential to free your family from fiat forever. But time is running out. BlackRock and co are aggressively buying an enormous amount of Bitcoin, okay? Today, because of the fiat system, wealth inequality is the highest levels it's been since the 1930s. Again, think back about that to that fourth turning thesis and that long-term debt cycle thesis. The last time we went through an unwinding of both of those cycles was in the 1930s when wealth inequality was as high as it is today. Top 1% owned 50%. 1971 obviously accelerated this. Bitcoin is our opportunity to fix the fiat slavery. Okay, so today, 4.5 million addresses hold more than 0.1 Bitcoin, so 10 million Satoshis. Now, if 4.5 million addresses hold that amount of Bitcoin, how many people actually hold 10 million Satoshis. I don't think it's 4.5 million. Okay. Most people have multiple addresses. If I had more than 0.1 Bitcoin, I would probably hold multiple addresses with multiple different sizes with UTXOs. Again, I don't have any Bitcoin. I lost it in a boating accident. And I paid taxes for all the Bitcoin that I sold. Again, shout out to the Australian Tax Office. But if I were to be holding that amount of Bitcoin, I will be holding multiple addresses. Okay. So I personally think it's likely that less than 1 million people hold 0.1 Bitcoin or 10 million Satoshis, or today that's around $6,000 worth of Bitcoin. Now, I know what some people will say, but exchanges service, 50 million people now, and they hold all their Bitcoin in one address. I think the way to measure adoption is wrong, but I don't think we should be trusting exchanges. If you have Bitcoin on an exchange, it is not your Bitcoin. That is not part of the mission. We failed the mission if BlackRock, and if you hold your Bitcoin with BlackRock, or if you hold your Bitcoin on an exchange, that is a measure of Bitcoin failing. We need 0.1 Bitcoin in self-custody of 100 million families. That's the mission. That's what we should be aiming for. Now, why do I keep saying 100 million families? Well, let's actually have a look at the on-chain data. So there's 21 million coins. Now, if you would actually divide those 21 million coins evenly between 0.1 Bitcoin, that would mean that around 210 million families have the potential to own 0.1 Bitcoin. But again, we know that not all the supply is available for sale. Hodl Waves here actually shows that 40% of the supply has not moved in more than 3 years. Think about that for a minute. That's massive. Think about what Bitcoin has done in the past 3 years. That means people bought the top in 2021 at around 50 to 60K, and they've held Bitcoin doing a 70% crash, running back up to 60K, and they're still holding, okay? So I believe it's realistic that there's probably only around 10 million Bitcoin actually available for sale. Now, that's my conservative estimate. I strongly believe there's a lot less than that actually available for sale, but let's be conservative. People call me crazy anyway because of my crazy haircut. So let's assume there's 10 million Bitcoin available for sale. The best case scenario, you divide that 10 million Bitcoin by 100 million entities, all holding 0.1 Bitcoin. So that's the best possible case scenario, and that's what we should be striving for. But time is running out, because BlackRock and the ETF friends are absolutely buying all of the Bitcoin. This chart is significant because in the orange bars, that is how much Bitcoin MicroStrategy holds. He's the billionaire with the most amount of Bitcoin behind Satoshi Nakamoto himself. Okay, and we can see that MicroStrategy, a billion-dollar tech company, has been buying Bitcoin for the past 4 years. They've been selling shares to buy Bitcoin. They've been sinking all of their profits every single month in from their tech company to buy Bitcoin. And we can see they have around 200,000 coins. That's around 1% of the total supply, okay? So again, they're a big company and they've got a good chunk of the Bitcoin supply, but it's taken them 4 years to do that. We can see in that green box right next to MicroStrategy, the 9 new Bitcoin ETFs have already bought more Bitcoin than MicroStrategy in the first 35 days of trading. It doesn't matter how you cut this cookie, it is not looking good for the mission to get 100 million families holding 0.1 Bitcoin. It's really not looking good. Okay, the trend is not our friend. Even on the most conservative estimate, where we look at only the net flows, where we've seen 100,000 net new Bitcoin bought in the first month of the Bitcoin ETF trading, extrapolate that data out a little bit. And you're going to see that in 20 months' time, all of the exchanges are going to be drained. Now, I'm hearing what some people are going to say, but Luke, you can't extrapolate that data out. You can't, because you can't assume the buying from the Bitcoin ETFs is going to stay the same. Well, this chart here is actually showing that the amount of buy pressure coming from these Bitcoin ETFs is actually increasing, okay? Just recently, this week, we saw the highest amount of volume on these Bitcoin ETFs that we ever saw. Now, this is absolutely unprecedented in the world of ETFs, okay? We've seen the ETF guru, Eric Balchunas. He tweets about this all the time, how it is unprecedented for an ETF to actually see increasing volume, okay? And again, this is all coming before the Bitcoin halving. We haven't even got into the interesting period of time with Bitcoin. So I think it's, obviously you can't assume we're going to see the same amount of growth month after month after month in these Bitcoin ETFs accumulating Bitcoin. But I am, because I'm really bullish. I think we should. These ETF issuers have trillions of dollars. Fidelity just came out recently and they said it makes sense to have a 2.5% allocation to Bitcoin. Again, they hold like $8 trillion of assets under management. I think that we're going to see a perpetual bid for Bitcoin, but it doesn't matter how you cut this cookie, it's not looking good. It looks as if the exchanges are going to be drained of Bitcoin in the next 20 months. Okay, even if you're more bullish, okay, now this is more interesting. Let's assume that the amount of buying stays constant. Okay, so around 300K Bitcoin are bought per month, okay, for easy, round, simplified maths. Well, let's assume that the grayscale selling stays at what it has been for the past 2 weeks, so around 50 million a day. Let's assume that stays constant as well. Well, that means you got 250K of net new flows into Bitcoin. And if we continue to see this data extrapolated into the future, you got no Bitcoin on exchanges in 8 months. Okay, so this is why I think 2025 could be our last chance to get 100 million families to 0.1 Bitcoin, okay? The everyday person is not going to be able to afford Bitcoin to be able to buy 0.1 Bitcoin when Bitcoin's at 200K. It's going to be $20,000, and we know that the everyday average person, they don't have $500 to pay in bills in a case of an emergency. We know that it's like 80% of Americans don't have $600 in case of an emergency. So this is why I think 2025 could be our last chance. Okay, once Bitcoin gets above those levels, the average everyday person won't be able to buy 0.1 Bitcoin. So the opportunity to you is coming today. Today is your last chance to buy 0.1 Bitcoin, 10 million Satoshis. This is $6,000 worth of Bitcoin today. And I believe this is going to be generational wealth to free your family from fiat forever. If you enjoyed this, check out the recent video that we recorded. It's on a very similar vein to this topic. I'll pop a link to that one right about there. But I want to hear from you guys. Do you have 0.1 Bitcoin? Again, don't dox your stack if you don't want to and you think that I'm a Fed. But anyway, I'll see you on the next video.